Staff Sergeant Emma Rodriguez had been folding uniforms for 3 months. 3 months of perfect creases, spotless fabric, and absolute silence. The other soldiers at Fort Harrison barely noticed her as she worked in the corner of the supply depot, her small hands moving with mechanical precision through endless piles of Army combat uniforms. But Emma noticed everything. She noticed how Corporal Jenkins always requested his uniforms be cleaned twice, claiming they weren't good enough the first time. She noticed how Lieutenant Morrison would linger near the classified document bins when he thought no one was watching. She noticed how Captain William Hayes treated her like she was invisible, walking past her station without so much as a glance. They all thought she was just another displaced soldier, demoted to laundry duty after some minor infraction. They were wrong. Emma had graduated top of her class from military intelligence school. She spoke 4 languages fluently, and had spent 2 years in Afghanistan analyzing enemy communications. But one mistake, trusting the wrong person with sensitive information, had cost her everything. The Army had quietly reassigned her to Fort Harrison, a small training base in rural Georgia, where she was told to keep her head down and her mouth shut. "Rodriguez," barked Sergeant First Class Thompson as he dumped another load of dirty uniforms on her table. "These better be done by 1600 hours or you'll be here all night again." Emma looked up briefly, meeting his eyes with steady calm. "Yes, Sergeant." Thompson scoffed and walked away, muttering something about wasted space to the soldier beside him. Emma had heard worse. Much worse. After her intelligence career imploded, the whispers had followed her everywhere. Some called her a security risk. Others called her a failure. A few called her much uglier names. She went back to folding, but her mind was elsewhere. For weeks, she'd been noticing patterns in the base's routine that didn't make sense. Small things that anyone else might dismiss as coincidence, equipment that went missing and reappeared in different locations, training schedules that changed at the last minute, communications equipment that malfunctioned during specific operations. Someone was feeding information to the outside. Emma was sure of it. The supply depot door swung open with a sharp bang and Captain Hayes strode in with his usual air of importance. At 35, he was the youngest captain at Fort Harrison, and he never let anyone forget it. His uniform was always immaculate, his bearing perfect, his confidence unshakable. "Thompson, I need a status report on the new equipment shipment," Hayes said, not bothering to lower his voice despite Emma working just 10 feet away. "Sir, everything's accounted for," Thompson replied, snapping to attention. "The night vision goggles arrived this morning and the communication devices are being distributed to the training units." "Good. And the exercise schedules for next week?" "Already distributed to all unit commanders, sir. Training operations will commence at 0600 hours Monday." Emma's hands never stopped moving, but her ears picked up every word. She'd seen those communication devices being unloaded. Standard military issue, but with modifications she couldn't quite identify from a distance. The kind of modifications that could easily include additional transmission capabilities. "What about her?" Hayes asked suddenly. Emma glanced up to find both men looking at her. Thompson shrugged dismissively. "Just the laundry girl, sir. Been here a few months. Keeps to herself." Hayes studied Emma for a moment, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating. She met his gaze steadily, waiting for him to speak. Instead, he turned back to Thompson as if she didn't exist. "Make sure she doesn't have access to anything sensitive," he said quietly. "We can't be too careful these days." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. She'd been handling sensitive material since before Hayes even knew what classified meant, but there was no point in defending herself. It would only draw more unwanted attention. After the men left, Emma continued her work in silence. She thought about the conversation she'd overheard, turning each word over in her mind like pieces of a puzzle. Hayes was careful, too careful for someone who should trust his own base's security protocols. His comment about being careful suggested he suspected a security breach, but his casual dismissal of her presence indicated he didn't consider her a threat. That was his first mistake. As the afternoon wore on, other soldiers came and went from the supply depot. Emma observed them all with the trained eye of an intelligence analyst. She noted who seemed nervous, who asked unusual questions, who lingered longer than necessary near sensitive materials. At 15:45, just as she was finishing the last batch of uniforms, Private First Class Maria Santos burst through the door in tears. "Emma," Thank God you're still here, Santos gasped, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I need help. Emma set down the uniform she was folding and turned her full attention to the younger woman. Santos was barely 20, fresh out of basic training and one of the few soldiers who actually acknowledged Emma's existence. What's wrong? Emma asked gently. It's my brother, Santos whispered, glancing around to make sure they were alone. He's been asking me weird questions about the base, about training schedules and equipment shipments. I thought he was just curious, but... Emma's pulse quickened. But what? But then I found out he's been hanging around with some guys I don't trust. Guys who've been asking a lot of soldiers' families about their work here. I think they're trying to get information. Emma kept her voice calm and reassuring. Have you reported this to anyone? Santos shook her head quickly. I can't. If Captain Hayes finds out my family might be involved in something, they'll discharge me. Or worse, I need this job, Emma. My mom depends on my pay. Emma understood the fear. Military families often found themselves caught between loyalty and survival, especially when money was tight. But if Santos's brother was being used to gather intelligence, the situation was far more serious than the young soldier realized. Listen to me carefully, Emma said, placing a steady hand on Santos's shoulder. You're going to go back to your quarters and act like nothing happened. Don't contact your brother until we figure this out. Can you do that? Santos nodded, relief flooding her face. You'll help me? I'll help you, Emma promised. After Santos left, Emma stood alone in the supply depot, her mind racing. This was the break she'd been waiting for. Concrete evidence that someone was actively seeking information about Fort Harrison's operations. But she couldn't go to Hayes or any of his officers with just Santos's story. She needed proof, and more importantly, she needed to figure out who on the inside was making it possible. As she locked up the supply depot for the night, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to remain invisible anymore. For too long, she'd accepted being dismissed and ignored, content to blend into the background while her skills went to waste. But now, soldiers' lives might be at stake, and Emma Rodriguez had never backed down from a fight that mattered. She just had to be smarter than everyone who underestimated her, which, she thought grimly as she walked across the darkening base, shouldn't be very hard at all. Tomorrow she would begin hunting for a spy, and she would start with the people Captain Hayes trusted most. Emma arrived at the supply depot before dawn, 2 hours earlier than her usual shift. The base was quiet except for the distant sound of morning PT formations beginning their runs. She had work to do, the kind of work that required absolute privacy. She'd spent half the night reviewing everything she knew about Fort Harrison's personnel, mentally cataloging every suspicious incident from the past 3 months. Now it was time to move from observation to action. The first thing Emma did was check the security logs for the supply depot. As someone assigned to laundry duty, she technically had no business accessing the computer system. But her intelligence training included more than just analysis. It included getting information that others didn't want her to have. The logs revealed exactly what she'd suspected. Over the past month, 3 people had accessed the depot after hours using override codes. Lieutenant Morrison, Sergeant First Class Thompson, and surprisingly, Captain Hayes himself. Emma frowned. Why would the base commander personally visit the supply depot at night? Unless he was conducting his own investigation or covering his tracks. Rodriguez, what the hell are you doing here so early? Emma spun around to find Thompson standing in the doorway, his face twisted with suspicion. She quickly minimized the computer screen and stood at attention. Catching up on work, Sergeant. The uniform shipment from yesterday needs to be processed. Thompson's eyes narrowed. Since when do laundry girls work overtime without permission? Since I want to make sure everything's ready for inspection, Sergeant. He studied her for a long moment, clearly looking for any sign of deception. Emma kept her expression neutral and respectful, playing the role of the dutiful soldier who just wanted to do her job well. Don't make a habit of it. Thompson finally grunted. And stay away from anything that's not your business. After he left, Emma realized her heart was pounding. Thompson's reaction had been too strong, too suspicious. Why would he care if she worked early? Unless he had his own reasons for wanting the depot empty during certain hours. She added his name to the top of her suspect list. The morning passed normally, with Emma folding uniforms and observing the steady stream of soldiers who came through the depot. But around 1000 hours, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Lieutenant Morrison was at the communication equipment again, but this time he was doing more than just looking. He was carefully photographing serial numbers with his personal phone. Emma continued folding, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced. Photographing equipment serial numbers was a classic intelligence gathering technique. Those numbers could be used to track supply chains, identify vulnerabilities, or plan targeted attacks on specific systems. Morrison finished his photography and headed for the door, but not before stopping at Emma's station. "Hey, laundry girl," he said with a condescending smile. "You've been working here a while now. You must see a lot of interesting equipment come through." Emma looked up with carefully practiced confusion. "Just uniforms and basic supplies, sir. Nothing interesting." "Come on," Morrison pressed, his tone becoming falsely friendly. "A smart girl like you must notice things. Equipment shipments, delivery schedules, that sort of thing." Every instinct Emma had developed during her intelligence career was screaming warnings. Morrison was fishing for information, and he was doing it badly. Either he was desperate or he thought she was too stupid to recognize what he was doing. "I just fold clothes, sir," she said with a slight shrug. "I don't really pay attention to anything else." Morrison's smile faltered slightly. "Right. Well, if you ever do notice anything unusual, you can always talk to me. I'm very interested in security matters." After he left, Emma felt sick. Morrison wasn't just gathering intelligence, he was actively trying to recruit her as a source. The fact that he felt comfortable approaching someone he assumed was just a displaced soldier suggested this wasn't his first attempt at finding inside help. She needed to know more about Morrison's activities, but she also needed to be careful. If he suspected she was onto him, he could disappear before she gathered enough evidence to expose him. The solution came to her during lunch. Emma rarely ate in the main dining facility, preferring to grab something quick and eat alone. But today, she needed to be where the gossip flowed freely. She found Private Santos sitting by herself in a corner, picking at her food with obvious anxiety. "Mind if I sit?" Emma asked quietly. Santos looked up with relief. "Please do. I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday." Emma sat down and leaned in slightly. "Have you heard from your brother?" "That's just it," Santos whispered. "He called last night asking about Lieutenant Morrison specifically. Wanted to know if I worked with him, what his schedule was like, whether he seemed trustworthy." Emma's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific. I just said I knew who he was." "But Emma, it scared me. Why would these guys be asking about specific officers?" Before Emma could answer, a shadow fell across their table. They looked up to find Captain Hayes standing over them, his expression unreadable. "Private Santos," he said coolly. "I need to speak with you about your family situation." Santos went pale. "Sir, there have been some concerns raised about potential security risks involving soldiers' family members. I think you know what I'm talking about." Emma watched the exchange with growing alarm. How did Hayes know about Santos's brother? Had Morrison reported their conversation? Or was there another source of information? "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong," Santos said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure you haven't, Private. But we need to be extra careful these days. There are people who would use our soldiers' families to get information about this base." Hayes's eyes flickered to Emma, and for a moment, she thought she saw something like recognition there. Then he focused back on Santos. "Report to my office at 1400 hours. We'll discuss how to protect both you and your family from these influences." After Hayes left, Santos looked at Emma with tears in her eyes. "What am I going to do?" Emma thought quickly. Hayes knowing about Santos's situation could be explained in several ways. He could be conducting a legitimate security investigation, or he could be using the information to control or intimidate Santos. Either way, the timing was suspicious. "Listen carefully," Emma said. "Go to the meeting, but don't volunteer any information you haven't already shared. If he asks about specific officers or schedules, tell him you don't know." "Can you do that?" Santos nodded, but Emma could see the fear in her eyes. The young soldier was caught in something much bigger than she understood, and Emma was the only person positioned to help her. That afternoon, while Santos was meeting with Hayes, Emma made her move. She used her break time to conduct reconnaissance of Morrison's office area. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. Morrison had been working late every night for the past 2 weeks, always alone. always after the cleaning staff had finished. His computer access logs showed he'd been downloading training schedules, equipment manifests, and personnel files, far more information than a lieutenant should need for his assigned duties, but the most damning evidence was what Emma found in Morrison's desk drawer when she pretended to deliver cleaned uniforms to his office. Hidden beneath some routine paperwork was a cell phone she'd never seen him use, a phone with an encrypted messaging app already open. Emma memorized the phone number visible on the screen and quickly photographed the message thread before anyone could catch her. The messages were coded, but she recognized the pattern from her intelligence training. Someone was passing regular updates about base operations to an outside contact. As she left Morrison's office, Emma felt the familiar thrill of a successful intelligence operation. But this time the stakes were personal. This wasn't about national security in some distant country. This was about protecting soldiers she worked with every day. She was so focused on her discovery that she almost missed the most important detail of all. Captain Hayes was watching her from across the hallway, and his expression was no longer one of casual dismissal. For the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Harrison, Emma had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was studying her just as carefully as she was studying them. The question was Hayes suspicious because he was trying to catch the spy, or because he was trying to protect one? As Emma returned to her folding station, she realized the game had just become much more dangerous. Someone knew she was asking questions, and they were starting to ask questions about her. Emma knew she was running out of time. 3 days had passed since her discovery in Morrison's office, and the lieutenant had been watching her with increasing suspicion. Worse, Private Santos hadn't returned from her meeting with Captain Hayes. The official word was that Santos had been granted emergency leave to deal with a family crisis. But Emma had checked the departure logs. Santos never left the base. She had simply vanished from the duty roster, and no one seemed willing to talk about where she'd gone. Emma was folding uniforms with mechanical precision when Sergeant Thompson approached her station, his usual scowl deeper than normal. "Rodriguez, you need to come with me," he said curtly. Emma's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" "Captain Hayes wants to see you now." The walk to Hayes's office felt like a death march. Emma's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had Morrison reported her presence in his office? Had someone seen her accessing computer files? Or worse, had they discovered her real background? Hayes's office was sparse and efficient, dominated by a large desk covered with neat stacks of paperwork. American and Army flags stood in one corner, and the walls were lined with commendations and photographs from his various postings. "Sit down, Rodriguez," Hayes said without looking up from a file he was reading. Emma sat at attention, studying the captain's face for any clue about what was coming. When he finally closed the file and looked at her, his expression was unreadable. "Tell me about your relationship with Private Santos," he said. "She's a fellow soldier, sir. We've spoken a few times." "About what?" Emma chose her words carefully. "General conversation, sir. She seemed homesick sometimes." Hayes leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes never leaving Emma's face. "Santos has made some serious allegations about security breaches on this base. She claims someone has been pressuring her family for information. I wouldn't know anything about that, sir. Wouldn't you?" Hayes picked up another file from his desk. "This is interesting reading, Rodriguez. It seems you have quite a background in military intelligence. 2 years in Afghanistan. Top security clearance, commendations for exceptional analysis work." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Her records were supposed to be classified. Her reassignment kept quiet. The fact that Hayes had access to her full file meant either he had connections high up the chain of command, or he was the security breach himself. "I was reassigned to general duties, sir," she said carefully. "Because you compromised an operation by trusting the wrong person." Hayes continued reading from the file. "Lost 3 assets and nearly got yourself killed when your source turned out to be working for the enemy." Emma's jaw tightened. The official report made it sound like a simple mistake in judgment, but the reality had been far more complex. She'd uncovered a network of corruption that went all the way to the top of her unit, and when she'd tried to report it through proper channels, she'd discovered that some of those channels were compromised. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Hayes closed the file and leaned forward, So why would a disgraced intelligence officer suddenly take an interest in the personal problems of a young private? I was trying to help a fellow soldier, sir. Were you? Or were you looking for an opportunity to prove you still had value as an analyst? Emma met his stare directly. I fold uniforms, sir. That's my job. For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Hayes stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground. Private Santos is safe, he said finally. But she's been moved to a secure location while we investigate her family's situation. For her own protection. I understand, sir. Do you? Hayes turned back to face her. Because I'm not sure you understand how dangerous it is to play amateur detective when there are real threats involved. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Hayes wasn't just warning her off. He was telling her that he knew exactly what she'd been doing. I think there's been a misunderstanding, sir, she said. Has there? Let me be very clear, Rodriguez. You will return to your duties and stop asking questions about things that don't concern you. You will not discuss Santos or her family with anyone, and you will report any suspicious activity to me personally. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Good. Because the next time we have this conversation, it won't be in my office. It will be in a military court. Emma was dismissed with a sharp nod, and she walked back to the supply depot on unsteady legs. Hayes knew everything. About her investigation, about Santos, probably about Morrison too. But his warning suggested he wanted her to stop digging rather than arresting her immediately, which meant either he was trying to protect the investigation, or he was trying to protect the spy. Back at her station, Emma tried to process what had just happened. Hayes having access to her classified files was disturbing enough, but his knowledge of her activities suggested a level of surveillance that went far beyond normal base security. Someone had been watching her as carefully as she'd been watching them. As the afternoon wore on, Emma noticed changes in the routine around her. Soldiers who usually came to the supply depot were nowhere to be seen. The few who did appear seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact and completing their business quickly. But the most unsettling change was Lieutenant Morrison. Instead of his usual condescending attitude, he now treated Emma with wary respect. The kind of respect given to someone who might be dangerous. At 1700 hours, as Emma was preparing to close the depot, Morrison appeared in the doorway. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 MPs flanked him, their hands resting casually on their sidearms. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Morrison said, using her full rank for the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Harrison. We need to talk. Emma's blood turned to ice. Morrison, knowing her real rank meant her cover was completely blown, but she forced herself to remain calm. About what, sir? About what you saw in my office 3 days ago. There was no point in denying it now. I was delivering uniforms, sir. Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You saw the phone, it wasn't a question. Emma nodded slowly. Then you know I'm not the person you should be worried about, Morrison continued. That phone belongs to our operation. We've been tracking communications between this base and outside contacts for 6 weeks. Emma's mind reeled. Morrison was undercover? But that didn't make sense with everything she'd observed. I don't understand, she said. Morrison glanced at the MPs, then back at Emma. I'm Counterintelligence Corps. So is Sergeant Thompson. We've been investigating suspected security breaches at Fort Harrison, and your little amateur investigation has been interfering with our operation. Emma felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Morrison and Thompson were the investigators, not the spies. Which meant, Captain Hayes, she whispered. Morrison nodded grimly. We believe Captain Hayes has been selling information to outside parties for at least 4 months. Training schedules, equipment manifests, personnel files, everything needed to plan an attack on this facility. But Santos, Emma protested. Her brother was asking questions. Her brother was working for us, Morrison interrupted. We needed to trace the information flow, so we had him ask specific questions to see how quickly they reached Hayes. It worked perfectly until you scared Santos into thinking her family was in danger. Emma sank into the nearest chair, her mind struggling to process this reversal. Everything she'd thought she knew was wrong. Morrison and Thompson weren't spies. They were trying to catch one. And the spy was the man who just threatened her in his office. Where is Santos now? She asked. Morrison's expression darkened. That's the problem. After Hayes questioned her, she disappeared. We think he realized she was our way of tracking the information flow, and now she's either in hiding or... He didn't finish the sentence, but Emma understood. Santos could be dead. We need your help, Morrison said suddenly. Hayes trusts you enough to warn you off instead of arresting you. That means he doesn't see you as a threat yet. Emma looked up at him sharply. You want me to spy on him? We want you to do what you've been doing. Observe and report. But this time, you'll be working with us instead of against us. Emma thought about Santos, about the young soldier who'd trusted her with her fears. If Hayes had hurt her because of Emma's investigation, then Emma owed it to Santos to see this through. What do you need me to do? Morrison smiled for the first time since she'd known him. Hayes is planning something big for tomorrow night. There's a major equipment transfer scheduled, and we believe he's going to use it to pass critical information to his contacts. What kind of information? The kind that could get American soldiers killed, Thompson said grimly, speaking up for the first time. We need proof of his treachery, and you're the only one positioned to get it. Emma stood up slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. For months she'd been treated like a failure, a security risk, someone whose career was over. But now these investigators needed her skills, the same skills that had gotten her in trouble in Afghanistan. I'll do it, she said. But I want Santos found alive. Morrison nodded. That's the plan. As the MPs escorted Morrison away, maintaining the pretense that Emma was in trouble, Emma remained in the supply depot long after closing time. Tomorrow night she would either help expose a traitor or walk into a trap that could cost her everything. But for the first time in months, Emma Rodriguez felt like a soldier again, and soldiers didn't abandon their comrades. Emma spent the night memorizing every detail of Morrison and Thompson's plan. The equipment transfer was scheduled for 2,200 hours. A convoy of communication devices and night vision equipment heading to a training facility in South Carolina. Hayes would personally oversee the manifest, giving him the perfect opportunity to photograph or copy sensitive technical specifications. But Emma's role wasn't just to observe. Morrison had given her a modified recording device disguised as a standard military radio. Her job was to get close enough to Hayes during the transfer to capture evidence of his treachery. It was dangerous work. If Hayes suspected anything, Emma could disappear just like Santos. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emma folded uniforms with mechanical precision, while her mind ran through every possible scenario. Hayes came by the supply depot twice, each time studying her with those cold blue eyes as if trying to read her thoughts. Rodriguez, he said during his second visit, you seem distracted today. Emma looked up with practiced innocence. Just tired, sir. Long week? Indeed. Hayes picked up one of the uniforms she'd just folded, examining it with unnecessary care. You know, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. About staying focused on your duties. Yes, sir. Good soldiers follow orders without question, he continued, his voice carrying a subtle threat. They don't ask unnecessary questions or involve themselves in matters beyond their understanding. Emma met his gaze steadily. I understand, sir. Hayes nodded slowly, but Emma could see he wasn't entirely convinced. He suspected something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to make him cautious. After he left, Emma realized her hands were shaking. Hayes wasn't just a trader selling information for money. There was something cold and calculating about him that suggested he enjoyed the power of deception. Men like that were dangerous when cornered. At 21:30 hours, Emma made her way to the motor pool where the equipment transfer was being staged. The area was lit by harsh floodlights, and she could see soldiers loading crates into 2 military trucks under Thompson's supervision. Morrison appeared beside her in the shadows between buildings. Hayes is in the logistics office, he whispered, reviewing the manifest one final time. This is your chance. Emma nodded and activated the recording device hidden in her jacket. The plan was simple. Get close enough to Hayes to record his activities without arousing suspicion. Morrison and Thompson would handle the arrest once they had evidence. But as Emma approached the logistics office, she heard voices coming from inside that made her blood run cold. Please, Captain, I haven't told anyone anything. A familiar voice pleaded. Santos. She was alive. Emma crept closer to the window, her heart pounding. Through a gap in the blinds, she could see Santos sitting in a chair, her hands zip-tied behind her back. Hayes stood over her with a cell phone in his hand. I know you haven't, Private, Hayes said calmly, but your usefulness has come to an end. My contacts no longer need information about training schedules. They need something much more valuable. I don't understand, Santos whispered. Hayes held up the phone and Emma could see he was recording. You're going to confess to being a spy. You're going to admit that you've been feeding information to hostile forces through your brother's contacts, and then you're going to have a tragic accident during tonight's convoy operation. Emma's blood turned to ice. Hayes wasn't just selling information. He was planning to murder Santos and frame her as the spy. It was the perfect cover. With Santos dead and blamed for the security breaches, Hayes could continue his treachery indefinitely. Emma had to act fast. She activated her radio and whispered urgently to Morrison, Santos is in the logistics office with Hayes. He's going to kill her. Stay back. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. We're moving in. But Emma knew they wouldn't be fast enough. Hayes was already forcing Santos to read from a prepared confession, and once he had that recording, Santos would die. Emma made a decision that went against every order she'd been given. She walked directly to the front door of the logistics office and knocked. Captain Hayes, you asked me to report here for additional duties. There was a long pause, then Hayes's voice called out. Rodriguez, this isn't a good time. Sir, Sergeant Thompson said it was urgent. Something about the manifest needing additional verification. Emma heard movement inside, then the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor. Hayes was hiding Santos. The door opened and Hayes appeared with his usual composed expression. But Emma could see tension in his eyes. I don't know what Thompson told you, but I didn't request any additional personnel tonight. Emma stepped closer, forcing Hayes to back into the office. Sir, he specifically said you needed help with classified documentation, something about security protocols. As she spoke, Emma let her gaze drift past Hayes to where Santos was hidden behind a filing cabinet. Their eyes met for a split second, and Emma saw desperate hope flash across the young soldier's face. There's been a misunderstanding, Hayes said firmly. Return to your quarters immediately. Of course, sir, Emma replied. But instead of leaving, she stepped fully into the office and closed the door behind her. But first, I think we should discuss what really happened to Private Santos. Hayes went very still. Santos is on emergency leave. No, Emma said quietly. Santos is sitting behind that filing cabinet with her hands zip-tied, being forced to confess to crimes she didn't commit. For a moment, absolute silence filled the room. Then Hayes smiled, a cold, predatory expression that transformed his entire face. You always were too smart for your own good, Rodriguez. I read your file very carefully. Brilliant analyst, terrible judge of character. It seems you haven't learned from your mistakes. Emma felt the familiar calm that had gotten her through countless dangerous situations overseas. Actually, Captain, I learned exactly the right lesson. When someone betrays their oath and endangers soldiers' lives, you don't walk away. You stop them. Hayes laughed. And how exactly do you plan to do that? You're a disgraced intelligence officer working laundry duty. I'm a decorated captain with an exemplary record. You're a traitor, Emma said simply. Prove it. Emma reached into her jacket and pulled out the recording device Morrison had given her. But she also pulled out a second device, one Hayes hadn't known about. This has been recording our entire conversation, she said, including your confession about forcing Santos to make false statements and your plan to kill her. Hayes's composure finally cracked. His hand moved toward his sidearm, but Emma was faster. Years of combat training kicked in as she lunged forward, using Hayes's moment of surprise to strike his weapon hand and send the pistol flying across the room. Santos, get down, Emma shouted as she grappled with Hayes. The captain was stronger, but Emma had training he'd never expected from a laundry girl. She used his own momentum against him, throwing him into the wall with enough force to stun him. The office door burst open, and Morrison rushed in with two MPs, weapons drawn. Stand down, Morrison shouted. Hayes, blood streaming from his nose, raised his hands slowly. This is all a misunderstanding. Rodriguez attacked me without provocation. Actually, Emma said, breathing hard, I think you'll find that the recording tells a different story. Morrison helped Santos to her feet, cutting her restraints with a knife. The young soldier was shaking but unharmed. Are you all right, Private? Morrison asked. Santos nodded, tears streaming down her face. He was going to kill me, make it look like an accident during the convoy. As the MPs handcuffed Hayes, he looked at Emma with pure hatred. You think this is over? he snarled. You think anyone will believe the word of a failed intelligence officer over mine? Emma walked over to face him directly. Captain, I may have made mistakes in the past, but I learned something important from them. The truth always comes out eventually. And when it does, it doesn't matter what rank you hold or how many commendations you have. What matters is whether you kept faith with the soldiers under your command. Hayes was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence. But the recording devices had captured everything. His confession, his plans, his complete betrayal of everything he'd sworn to protect. 3 days later, Emma stood in the same office where Hayes had threatened her, but this time facing Colonel Martinez, the new base commander. Her personnel file lay open on the desk, but now it included new documentation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Martinez said, I've reviewed the complete report of this investigation. Your actions not only exposed a serious security breach, but saved Private Santos's life. Emma stood at attention. I was just doing my duty, sir. Were you? Because according to this report, you directly disobeyed orders, conducted an unauthorized investigation, and put yourself in considerable danger. Emma's heart sank. Even after everything, was she going to be punished again? Martinez smiled. Exactly the kind of initiative and courage we need in military intelligence. How would you feel about returning to your original career field? Emma felt tears prick her eyes. Sir? Fort Harrison needs a new intelligence officer. Someone who understands that real security comes from soldiers who watch out for each other, not just from following protocols. Are you interested? Emma thought about Santos, about Morrison and Thompson, about all the soldiers who depended on people like her to keep them safe. Yes, sir, she said firmly. I'm very interested. 6 months later, Emma stood in the same supply depot where she'd once folded uniforms. But now she wore the insignia of a warrant officer, and soldiers came to her for intelligence briefings instead of clean laundry. Private Santos, now promoted to specialist, stopped by her office regularly. Not for information, but for guidance from someone who'd proven that rank and recognition weren't as important as courage and integrity. Emma had learned the most important lesson of her military career. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from the people everyone else ignores, and sometimes the strongest soldiers are the ones who've been tested by failure and chosen to keep fighting anyway. Captain Hayes had been sentenced to 20 years in military prison. Morrison and Thompson had received commendations for their investigation, and Emma Rodriguez, the woman who folded uniforms, in the corner, had become the most trusted intelligence officer at Fort Harrison. She'd proven that heroes aren't always the ones standing in the spotlight. Sometimes, they're the ones watching from the shadows, waiting for their moment to protect the people who matter most.